The man who, of course, knows the identity of the mole talked for the first time about
Do you have any
the
clues?
on him.
No, it could be anyone.
At all. No one will ever get me to reveal a source's name, or sources' names. Full stop.
The paper specifically said sources close to the Queen.
There are hundreds of people who think they're close to me.
I wouldn't have anything to do with...
You don't think it's Charles, do you?
Don't be ridiculous, Philip.
I mean, no journalist...
I wouldn't put it past the boy.
But that won't happen.
Mr. Andrew Neil, editor of the Sunday Times, announced that he would make further disclosures if the palace didn't retract their statement, saying his story was unfounded.
You're not bothered by all this, are you?
Right for the Queen. She doesn't have an election to fight.
It'll probably turn out to be a fake. Now forget it was the Sunday Times that wanted to publish the Hitler diaries. Shame they were a fake. Would have been a jolly good read.
Mrs. Thatcher was dismayed by the story. She told one of her confidants, who later passed it on to me, it had taken 9 points off her in the opinion polls. She knew she was going to fight the miners. She knew she was going to have to fight Labour. It never crossed her mind that she would also have a fight with the royal family.
The Queen now had a full-blown constitutional crisis on her hands.
Bill, could you come and see me in the audience room? And bring Michael, too.
Though what the Queen said at the time was probably more popular with the country as a whole than the policies of Mrs. Thatcher at the time, the country would soon have turned on any monarch who thought she could interfere with the politics of the country. Unelected hereditary monarchs in the 20th century were not meant to do that.
I need to know if you are the source of the Sunday Times article.
Absolutely not. No, that information must have come from someone else.
When I read the article and I saw the quotes, it's blindingly obvious it was Michael Shea. All the expressions, all the phrases I had heard from Shea's mouth over the last 3 or 4 weeks.
The press seem more interested in the so-called palace mole than the contents of the article.
I'm sure the press will soon get bored, ma'am.
I'm not prepared to run that risk. I want a denial issued.
We can draft one immediately. I suggested it sent to the Times, ma'am.
Good. I want it sent after Andrew's wedding.
Yes, of course, ma'am.
You have to go back to Queen Victoria writing a letter to the editor of the Times saying that she wasn't coming out of seclusion in the 19th century to have a comparable response.
I'll write the draft if you could check it over for any inaccuracies.
Yes, of course.
The letter appeared in the Times, seeking to rubbish the story on what appeared to me to be false grounds. It was then that we were in open public confrontation with the palace.
But back at Clarence House, the moment the crowds were waiting for, a first sight of the royal bride in the gleaming glass coach.
The Queen went to Andrew's wedding confident that a letter to the Times would bring an end to the matter. But Mrs. Thatcher was still curious as to the identity of the mole. The following day, the Queen was opening the 9th Commonwealth Games in Edinburgh, which, thanks to Mrs. Thatcher, had the lowest number of competing countries of her reign. As the Queen was settling down to enjoy the spectacle, Mrs. Thatcher was well on her way to finding out the identity of the palace mole.
It can't be William Heseltine. It's not one of the family. If I were a gambling woman, I'd put my money on Michael Shea.
Then you'd be a wealthy woman.
Thank you, dear.
Safe in the knowledge that the Sunday Times affair was closed, the Queen's attention turned to entertaining Mrs. Thatcher at her residence in Edinburgh.
I hope that Sunday Times article hasn't caused you too much distress.
Not at all, ma'am. I'm just sorry that you've been terribly let down.
Let down?
Yes, apparently the source of the article is very close to you.
You surprise me, Prime Minister. I can hardly believe that you'd be so interested in recent press speculation.
I became interested when I heard that the source was your press secretary, ma'am.
Are you quite sure about that?
Yes, ma'am. I understand the Observer will be naming him tomorrow. I think we need to make quite sure that it never happens again.
One week after the Sunday Times revelations, Michael Shea found himself named by the Observer as the Palace Mole. And then he found himself sharing breakfast with Mrs. Thatcher.
Good morning, Michael.
Good morning, Prime Minister. I'm really terribly sorry about the piece in the Sunday Times.
Forget about it, dear. I think it's the Queen to whom you should be apologising. She's the one who will suffer the most.
They completely misinterpreted me. Bill has sent a strongly worded letter of complaint to the Times.
My father always likened the press to Pandora's box. Once it's open, it's impossible to close.
The home athletes put on a show fit for a queen. Roger Black, a 19-year-old student from Portsmouth, causing the first major upset on the track in the 400 metres.
I backed you to the hilt. You even helped me write to the denial to the Times. You have humiliated me. I can't sack you, but I think under the circumstances, it would be best if you left the job.
And to go where?
I'm sure I can find you something.
At long last, the 25-year-old Englishwoman had fulfilled her promise.
Thanks to the African boycott, for the first time in 20 years, England came top of the medals table. But once the leaders of the African nations realised that the Queen was in opposition to Mrs. Thatcher, they had second thoughts about leaving the Commonwealth.
I think it helped to keep the Commonwealth together. It did the Commonwealth a favour. But the Queen got dragged into politics, and it had the seeds of the destruction of the monarchy within it, if it had carried on. No monarch can get involved in politics, particularly party politics, if it wants to survive and stay as head of state above the political fray. One of the few justifications for a hereditary monarch is that you've chosen a family that you put above the political fray, and the head of state is separate from the politics of the day.
At the end of the summer, Mrs. Thatcher shifted her position. But it was only a minor U-turn. She accepted the nominal sanctions against South Africa which were being proposed by the European community, but she still refused to impose the Commonwealth's full comprehensive sanctions that the Queen had so ardently hoped for.
Remarkable what can be conjured up in the middle of nowhere.
I understand you've recently purchased a retirement home.
Yes, in Dulwich. Margaret wanted to go to Oxford, but Dulwich is very pleasant and close to the centre of London.
Dulwich, that's near Peckham, isn't it?
I just hope we didn't buy the house too prematurely. As I say to my cabinet colleagues, the unexpected always happens.
I'm sure that's true of politics. I always think it must be a comfort for the public to know that the monarch is always there, even though politicians may come and go.
It must be a comfort to the British public to know that, unlike several Commonwealth countries, they can elect their head of government. And of course the public knows that my policies will continue long after I've left office. Could I have a drop more wine, please, dear?
To read interviews with all of the leading actresses and watch exclusive video, head to channel4.com/The Queen. Tomorrow night, 9, Barbara Flynn plays the Queen during her Annus Horribilis 1992. And next tonight, a semi-final place in the offing in Gordon Ramsay's F Word.